We have four panelists today, and I'm very excited to hear from each of them. I'll begin with introductions. I'm Ruben Keller, a faculty member here at Loyola in the School of Environmental Sustainability. The panel today, we're going to hear first from Dr. Dawn Martin-Hill, a member of the Mohawk Nation who resides at the Six Nations of the Grand River with her family. Dr. Martin-Hill was the first Indigenous cultural anthropologist in Canada, and she is currently the Indigenous lead for the Global Centre for Climate Change and Transboundary Waters and Professor Emeritus of Indigenous Studies at McMaster University. After Dr. Martin-Hill, we'll hear from Malia Geertsma, the Director of Clean Water and Equity at the Alliance for the Great Lakes, where she has been since 2023. In that role, she is responsible for leading the Alliance's water infrastructure team with a focus on advancing equity and access to clean drinking water and sanitation and ensuring that people are safe from flooding. Cheryl Watson is with us. Cheryl worked as a computer applications programmer for 20 years before going back to complete her Master's of Education and becoming a high school teacher. And her career as an educator in disadvantaged communities provided her the experience in teaching youth science and the importance of protecting the earth. And based on that, she moved into a role as a high school science coach at the Illinois Institute of Technology. And finally, Dan Egan, a journalist who has covered the Great Lakes for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, who did cover the Great Lakes for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel for many years, wrote some articles, very long articles, which I found enormously useful when I was a graduate student. So while at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, he was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Explanatory Reporting in both 2010 and 2013. He writes long-form pieces still about climate change for national media outlets, including the New York Times, and is a senior water policy fellow at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's School of Freshwater Sciences. If you've ever taken my freshwater ecology class, then you have read his book, The Life and Death of the Great Lakes. And more recently, he's published a book, The Devil's Element, Phosphorus and a World Out of Balance. So those are our panelists today. I'll now invite Dr. Martin-Hill to the podium and for the first presentation.
Sego. That's how you greet people in my language. Can you say Sego? Sego. There you go. I'm going to get you to do that on social media for my community. So I'm retired, but not retired. I just couldn't handle teaching full-time and running all these projects. But mainly our goal is taking care of the natural world as a Haudenosaunee woman. There's 6 of our nations that all live in my community. We're the only one where all 6 live. And most of our history is along the Great Lakes. So we combine multiple levels of research, not just water quality data, hydrology, hydrogeology, but clinical psychology and so on and so on. And I'll explain how Indigenous knowledge works. So this is our philosophy about water, and I think critical is to understand when we talk about water. Oh, my stopwatch went off a little early. When we talk about water, we talk about our responsibility to water, not our right to water. So again, that's a very Western paradigm that it's operated within human rights and so on. We have problems with that because we look at the world as having rights. Water has rights, and we have a responsibility to uphold those rights. So it's a very different kind of understanding, and we often have trouble operating in a Western paradigm. So this just kind of summarizes how our great law, which is our Constitution, which is over 1,000 years old, which is what the, unfortunately, United States got really wrong, but tried to model after. You can look it up. They acknowledge that. Clinton, I think, finally said, yeah, we copied or appropriated, but we took out women, we took out children, we took out the natural world. They kind of messed up. We're all paying the price for that right now. So Six Nations is basically this little orange dot is what we have left of our traditional deed. We fought many imperial powers. Our people fought everybody. So we kind of we're a military power in this region, and we, as you can see, they almost put us in as a border. So we're the reason that Ontario is not part of the U.S., much to the current leader's chagrin. But you can see how they positioned us, because we are the ones who won that war. If you look at the proper history that's there, it was Mohawks and Haudenosaunee that were largely fending off in the War of 1812. So this is where we are. This is what we have left, and we live along the Grand River. And yes, we're fighting for the rest of our lands that were illegally taken, because the idea was back in the day that we weren't going to make it into this century. We were going to die out by the 1900s. So they kind of messed around with our trust and our money that we had received from Britain, et cetera. And we're still here. So we defeated the odds. So the United Nations, has done these intergovernmental panel on climate change reports with biologists and so on. And they found out in 2018 in their report, and then again in 2021, that the healthiest lands and waters in the world are managed and held by Indigenous people, who only make up 6% of the world's population. So over 80% of all biodiversity on this planet is managed by Indigenous people. That's a really really startling stat. So then 2021, they went, we better find out what this is. How does it work? Why are they doing so well? What are they doing? We don't know what traditional ecological knowledge is. We don't know what Indigenous people are doing, but we know it's working. So I won't go over all of this in the 10 minutes, but you can find most of this on our website in any of our publications. So the problem is they understand that we need to work together, but most scientists have never worked with Indigenous people, let alone Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous ways of knowing. So we started the Oniganos Project through Global Water Futures, and we co-created what we wanted to look at, how we wanted to look at it, with knowledge holders, elders, community experts, who then design our project. I go out and recruit the scientists that we need, and then we work together and we submit our proposals. We do not wait for scientists to come to us and say, hey, I want to look at X, Y, Z, and we're like, that's not important to our people. So we're trying to shift that colonial approach to working with Indigenous people. So what we did with the climate change is, once we got this data of our community, we went, I can't give this information to my community. We already have some of the highest suicidal ideations in the country. We already have youth that are struggling to get over colonialism, and now I'm going to hand them this. I can't do that. So that's when we went out and got a grant in health and put together a team. And we did it based on Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous ways of knowing. So we had elders sit down and say, how do we do this? What do we do? How do we give information to the community that's going to be empowering and strength-based and not deficit-based? So Indigenous knowledge is in the language, it's in our way of knowing, it is in our own pedagogy with our own assumptions about the world. I can go to New Zealand and talk to Maori, they get it, we don't got to explain to each other. I can talk to my neighbor or who I went to school with for 25 years, and they don't, it's like I'm talking Greek. They're like, no, that's not how it works, Dawn. So it's a lot of work to try to bring Indigenous knowledge into the academy. And that's where tech comes in. So traditional ecological knowledge is simply a scholarly based activity that is driven by scholars, that works with elders, and it is not centering Indigenous knowledge, it's partnering with Indigenous knowledge. So one, Indigenous knowledge lives with our people, it's thousands of years old, it's place-based, it's accumulated knowledge, passed down through song, dance, story, and many other ways, pictographs and so on. And then we partner with scholars. So that's tech, or what people now call tech. So traditional knowledge, multi-layered, it talks about a holistic approach. So we look at health, we look at well-being, we look at spirituality, culture, and then we try to build our team based on these premises, and it's very community-driven. And the questions that we pose are posed by our elders or knowledge guardians, and then they're negotiated and mediated with our scientists. It actually works really, really well. So this is one of our teams, the Sionegino's tech team. So I have students, they're all Indigenous women. I don't know why, but we're a matriarchal society. Women kind of run everything, which is why our communities have a lot of things that are going well for them. I hate to say it, but it's reality. We're not a patrilineal society. So the men support us when I need the chiefs and so on. They're there for us. But the women do the day-to-day grind, and they understand how things work dynamically. And they also have a lot of families that they then can pull in and mobilize community to do things. So this is, my daughter is the second left, Makasha, but she did not want to come because she was harassed at the border when we went to the University of Michigan. So there are things happening that are not good. At the bottom is Colin, an engineer. He's my postdoc. Emily's my PhD archaeology student. Hillary is our health lead fellow, and Rohini is our postdoc in history. So we work together really well. This is how we create our team, and it brings together and intersects with all these other teams. They don't operate together all the time, but then they will come together and share data, what they've collected, and that it impacts the next stage or the next year of what we should be focusing on. We did not expect to see mental health as one of the highest impacts of water insecurity, but it was, and it shocked us in every way. We worked with the birthing center. We had the midwives interview over 50 moms. We had no idea the amount of stress, along with they're going to run out of water because we are a water insecure community. We also used an international scale that's used at the UN. It's usually used in other countries, not in the G7, but I took the HY scale when we did with health services, and we did the health survey. I said, let's apply the HY scale and see where Indigenous communities fall when it's compared to other countries like Kenya, India, and other Indigenous communities around the world. And we found that, in fact, we have really high rates of different waterborne water illnesses, but we also have high levels of water insecurity. So this is what it looks like on paper as an academic. These are the teams, and then I put together committees, whether it's the youth committee, whether it's an elders committee, a language committee, and then they intersect with all of these different activities and projects that our large team works with. So what we wanted to do was understand how to mobilize the information that we're gathering, which is really, really difficult because a lot of it is languages that people don't understand. And again, we wanted to make sure we were sensitive to people having at least some hope for their future, especially for our young people. So we focused on digital storytelling, which is like I would give schools, I would give students funding, and they would create these stories. They would work with their traditional leaders, elders, and they would put together 3 to 5 minute, and we have over 30 of those on our website that are then teaching tools that our teachers use and other folks in the community. So these are the stories that they've done, and I will play one really quickly because I'm going to run out of time. So this is done by Denise, who is in that photo, who now runs Six Nations language program and is focused on environment.
Wai gweni wa utkato nu wa iro nekne o nega iga nega de zi o hunza gwego nega holone o nega nos. So when Sky Woman comes from the sky world, she goes through this dark tunnel first, And when she emerges from the dark tunnel, that was her first words that she said, Nekne o nega iga. So when she lands here on
So I'm going to stop it just
the
because
back of the
we got to
turtle,
be mindful of
that
time. But you can see all of these on our website,
represents
all of the digital stories. I don't know how to get out of here now. Oh, here we go. The other thing the elders wanted was for us to create a virtual reality, and I said, sure, no problem. Be careful if you work with elders. So what we did was we took our teachings from Sky World about Orenda, which is power, which is what happens to adolescents, when they're slamming doors and stuff. And our teachings are supposed to discipline them at that time. So we took all of that knowledge and we said, okay, let's create a virtual reality based on Sky World teachings about water, but it also talks about how the Great Lakes were made. The Great Lakes were made by the Creator after He made us out of clay. We are made out of the clay from this earth. And He dragged His fingers so that we had drinking water because it was all salt water. And that's why they call it Finger Lakes. I don't know if you knew that, but anyway, so we have long history with this area, with the Great Lakes. It's a big part of our teachings, and we include some of those in our digital stories. But we also, I can't show you that, but no, get out. It's in Mohawk and English. I just wanted to give you samples. And then the other thing, and the last thing I'll leave with, is that we upload all of this in Terra Stories. And this was when I went to the Amazon, and I worked with the Amazon conservation team and talked to elders from there, and I couldn't understand how they all had a map of their rivers from like a view of above. So I was kind of interrogating all that, but they put it up in a digital, it's an open access Terra Stories. You can also close it if you have sensitive information. And so we worked with the teachers. The kids go out, they learn how to test water, they upload the data, but we also upload teachings, we upload our language, our species, what are the kids observing, what kind of birds, trees, and they also offer prayer or acknowledgement of those things when they're going out. So we're working on this, and we're working with other tribes from around the Great Lakes to also upload, because it is free and open access around the Great Lakes, because so much of our history is tied to that. And you can go see our publications as well as our digital stories and our social media, which is what I want you all to say hi to Six Nations after we're all done here. Yahweh, thank you, Danito.
I am going to just take a moment to recognize the larger context in which we are gathered here today, regardless of where you stand on environmentalism or climate change or the proper role of government. We are in a moment of upheaval that itself is causing uncertainty, stress, and anxiety to people in general and to public servants in particular, and I just want to acknowledge that. I've been personally up since 5:30 a.m. trying to track Congress, so if I stumble a little bit, please just some grace. It's a tough time. While these times may create even greater hurdles than we have faced in the past, they also make clear how critical this work is on climate change and addressing injustices in our future. My presentation reflects my about 20 years of experience as a public health advocate and attorney doing environmental justice work about the last decade or so, focused on flooding and sewage-related issues. It highlights common threads among issues in different places throughout the US, though I will focus on Chicago and Cook County, and I collaborate with partners who are taking a similar approach in Northwest Indiana. And it is based on what I've been told and what is witnessed by advocates and experts like Cheryl Watson, sitting to my right, who live these issues every day. My intention with this presentation is not to provide answers, but to provoke questions and thoughts from you by suggesting that frameworks, the modern Western environmental frameworks for considering flooding, have been inadequate to recognize and address disparities in the most impacted communities. And I'll use some data visuals to do so. I'll pose that we haven't been asking the right questions, or at least the questions that we have been asking are not complete or sufficient. I'll also pose that an alternative way of looking at the issues is to ask whether some areas of Chicago and Cook County are more vulnerable or burdened by flooding, and historically have shown more resilience to these issues, and if so, why? And that by vulnerable, we mean not solely whether a person or neighborhood is at high risk of having a physical flooding or sewage event backup. So let me make sure I'm on the right slide. Okay. So folks may be aware that in 2023, there were massive storms that hit Cook County in both the summer and fall, with neighborhoods in Chicago taking a particularly heavy hit. In the wake of these storms, there was public discussion about why it flooded so badly on Chicago's west side in particular. And there was a reporter from WBEZ's Black Voices who asked this question of representatives from the Chicago Department of Water Management and the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District. And here's what they had to say.
At the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, but they said no representatives were available. So here is what Kevin Fitzpatrick, Assistant Director of Engineering, said about why the West Side took on so much water earlier this week on Chicago Tonight.
We've seen this lately in these weather patterns. It was sort of, they call it a microburst, or where the rainstorm really just sat in this area. And in general, Chicago got about 3 to 4 inches, but Cicero, the west side of Chicago, they measured 8.9 inches of rain over 12 hours on Sunday. And combined with a little bit of rain before and a little rain after, it's unprecedented amounts, and it's something that's very difficult to deal with.
Mentioned earlier, you said that the sewages don't really have the capacity for the amount of water that we received, but seemingly the flooding is specific to the city's west side. Can you speak to why that part of our city was hit harder than other areas, if you are doing the work to make sure that the sewages and the drain pipes and everything are clear throughout the city?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we've seen this in the last couple of rain events, these with climate change, these very isolated, intense storms. So when we map our water in basements compared to the rainfall that happened on Sunday, it's a very good correlation. So the simple answer for the west side was an intense amount of storm water that fell in that area. The storm sort of stalled out and stayed in the area. We sort of saw that, if you recall, last September, there was a very bad event as well that happened, and it stalled out, in that case, over the north side. And that's where we saw water in basements. And then before that, in July, on the southwest side. So it's correlating to where that storm is stalling out. That's a little different with climate change than what we would previously have seen, where a storm sort of moves across the city.
So in sum, it flooded on the west side because that's where it rained, which is true to some extent. The summer of 2023 storm's worst rains were concentrated over the west side, according to rainfall maps that we've looked at. But is that all that's going on? Prior to the 2023 and 2024 floods, the Center for Neighborhood Technology, a longstanding Chicago-based organization that has been working for years on flooding issues with particular expertise in data analytics, put out an analysis of urban flood risk by race across Chicago. They looked at a combination of data related to flood claims, assessing the number of claims rather than the dollar amount of claims at the zip code level. And this is the picture that resulted. I guess it's on your left. In the fall of 2024, the U.S. Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, presented its own trends analysis of requests for individual assistance in Chicago and Cook County following federally declared flooding disasters. Unlike the CNT analysis, FEMA used point data that's not otherwise available to the public. And this is data on individual households that sought help from FEMA after they were flooded out. And the picture on the right is what resulted. Another set of data following a very similar pattern is that of race within the city of Chicago. You all may be aware that Chicago has a dark history of racial segregation, with redlining and related institutional discriminatory practices having their roots in Chicago. In the 1930s, when Chicago was still being physically established, Black residents were almost entirely excluded from living outside of the so-called Black Belt south of downtown along what's now the Dan Ryan corridor. In the 1950s and 60s, there was, as many people know, the Dan Ryan built right through the heart of some of these neighborhoods, displacing 81,000 residents. The vast majority of them were Black. By the 1960s, Chicago had experienced more than a decade of movement of Black residents out of the Black Belt and into surrounding communities. This picture is on the left. This is also an important era for the sewer systems, as in the mid-1960s, intensive discussions began around what to do to address flooding and sewer issues across the region. And in the early 1970s, decision makers committed to a combined sewer system and locked in the concept of the deep tunnels feeding into treatment plants that discharge into rivers. This system is otherwise known as TARP. By the 1980s, Black residents had spread further out into the south and west sides. This is also an important era, as Mayor Harold Washington took office in 1983 and served until 1987, when his service as mayor was tragically ended. At the time, Mayor Washington passed a major bond that funded significant local sewer updates, including a number of projects on the south and west sides. This is another important map, and this is a map of the major trunk lines of the deep tunnel system that I described earlier. And I'm just going to leave it up for a minute and ask if anything is striking you about this map, given the other data that you've seen in this presentation so far. Also, just a little bit of information, if it's not obvious from the image itself. The different green and blue areas are basically sort of the areas that feed into those major trunk lines of the sewer system. So there's one along the Des Plaines River, and then there's what's called the mainstream tunnel that kind of cuts down on the north, goes closer to the shore, and then goes out along I-55. This is another map that I think is really interesting to look at. Many environmental advocates who advocate on stormwater and flooding issues focus primarily on what's known as green infrastructure as a key solution, including for disadvantaged communities. Many are uncomfortable speaking about gray infrastructure or the pipes and pumps in the sewer system. Green infrastructure mimics the natural flow of water over and through the landscape, encouraging water to soak into the ground where it falls, rather than running off into pipes and pumps in the sewer system. This image is an excerpt from a map of the Natural Solutions tool, specifically a data layer called Protected. This layer reflects areas with low to high potential for promoting the natural absorption of rainfall to increase resiliency, improve water quality, and reduce community flooding. In other words, green infrastructure's potential to address localized flooding. And I'm wondering if anything is striking to you about this excerpt, which overlaps with the CNT and the FEMA maps we saw previously. So if folks, again, might be hard to orient to the maps. This is basically the portion where the Dan Ryan kind of splits and goes into what I call the upside down Y. And so you've got parts of Roseland, Pullman, Chatham, and some of those other communities along the corridor that we saw in the FEMA and the CNT maps. And I'd also pose the question of what might explain this pattern of potential for green infrastructure in areas that have high levels of flood claims and requests for assistance. So I know this is a bit of a jumble. When I first showed some of these slides to folks, somebody commented and said, it would be really helpful if you showed all the images together at the end. I kind of threw this together realizing it's a bit of a jumble. If you're a GIS fanatic, you'd probably layer all of these together. We don't have them all in corresponding digital layers right now. Ironically, with a FEMA map, FEMA's shut down. They're not talking to anyone right now. You can't get data out of them, so we can't do that with the map that we were shown this fall. But I'm just gonna leave this up here for a minute as well so folks can kind of sit with these images and see what is coming up for you as you look at them. I'm gonna move on to the last slide, and hopefully folks have gotten this sort of in their heads for now. So in closing, I hope this presentation has gotten you all thinking about the problem we are trying to solve. While it's true that correlation does not imply causation, looking at correlation can help us begin unpacking causation. I hope it's given you a new lens to start thinking about the starting point of vulnerability that we are trying to address and the end point of resilience that we are trying to achieve. And I hope it's piqued an interest in you to dig deeper into history to understand how we got here, both because it matters today and because it has critical lessons for our future. And I just want to leave you with the last thought that there is always some immediate crisis that's cited as a reason not to do the just thing. And I'd like us to ask ourselves, what is the most immediate crisis, and is it preventing us from doing what justice requires? Thank you.
Thank you. We're now going to move into a portion where I get to ask some questions. First of all, Cheryl, so building upon what we've just seen from Malia, I know that you grew up in a community that was heavily influenced by flooding. I'd be very interested to hear what that was like. And we're at a climate change conference. I'd be very interested to hear from you and perhaps other panelists about how those experiences that you've had, how they might be different for people in the future as we move into more intense climate change.
Thank you. My name is Cheryl Watson, and I've been an advocate for 15 years after I had other careers. But what drew me into it was because I've been living this experience practically all my life. And my parents were living in the Black Belt in the 40s and early 50s. They had to go through a lot to even try to get a loan, a mortgage to buy a house. So they had to get someone to vouch for their character to get the loan. So we moved into Chatham in 1957. It still was primarily Caucasian, but as you know, there was a white flight. People just ran out of the neighborhood, and that opened up the doors for more African Americans to move out of the congested Black Belt and have the opportunity to own a home for the first time. So with that, we had mixed income because you had doctors, lawyers, laborers, teachers, all in the Black Belt with less than honorable housing available to them. So when they came to Chatham, Chatham was like nirvana. So their own spirits told them, we're going to revitalize this community, and we're going to just have our own rules to preserve the sanity, the peace, the connectedness, and build a community that our children can grow up in safely, get a good education for a good future. And so I benefited from that. I have 7 brothers. I'm the only girl. And so when they moved, I was about 2 years old. But I was smart. And whenever those rainstorms hit, my parents were like, what is this? They weren't expecting this. I don't think there was any transparency about the conditions in the neighborhood. And so they moved out there, and they were fighting every spring, because that's mostly when it rained then. A lot of flooding, scrambling. My dad was the only income. He'd have to get up early in the morning and try to work on it. My older brothers were in high school. They had to take time out before they had to go to school. And eventually, when I was about 3 or 4, I was tipping down the stairs and looking and seeing all this yucky water floating around in the basement, and I was like, whoa. So I had my little rain boots, and I thought I was going to get into it. Well, it was too deep for me to step off in it. But this is the memories that I have from childhood, struggling and being on edge every spring and summer about what's going to happen. So with people being able to come out into the area, they had the same shock that my parents did. They didn't know what was going on. At that time, they had political structures where you had precinct captains that were supposed to keep you in touch. They had no answers either, and some of the local papers were raising these questions, but you didn't have a voice for the community. A lot of the politicians were not really at the table. And so we suffered for years. And here I am, about to turn 70 next month, and it's still raining and flooding, and it'll be worse because of climate change. And with my advocacy, it's been up and down, barriers here, barriers there, promises, not knowing, just learning how all of this works, just not knowing if there was a solution.
Cheryl, did anyone come into, when has anyone tried to explain to the community why Chatham floods so badly compared to other parts of the city?
Well, for years, like I said, we were not being engaged with. People would talk in the community, but the fear was the insurance companies would find out and they would raise your rates. And a lot of people were just making that mortgage. They had just enough. They couldn't handle expensive repairs, or did they even know exactly what it needed to be done. So they would just work together. The men would get together and help each other clear out what has happened. But as far as getting a direct message about this is what's happening, this is how you rectify it, that didn't happen. And so my inner self, once I started seeing the advocacy groups, I felt like, okay, I need answers because I live in that house and I have to be worried about it by myself. So, and we're still not quite sure about how it's going to be fixed or if it's going to be fixed.
Has anyone ever talked to you about whether there was anything wrong with the larger infrastructure or any of the, the water system or the highways and the roads that were built around the area, or anything about this area in particular that makes it vulnerable to flooding?
Well, with my entry point into the advocacy role, I started looking to agencies, advocacy groups that were dealing with water issues. And so I began to understand better just how the sewer system works and kind of deduce myself about what was probably happening. And it wasn't until around 2010, 2012 that the Center for Neighborhood Technology was running a lot of advocacy training. And then they started the Rain Ready Chatham advocacy group. They got funding. And so we formed a steering committee, and that's how I started learning even more from, the Army Corps engineers and things like that. So I started looking at, okay, well, what type of things does the homeowner need to do and the cost? And I saw that this is cost prohibitive for most people.
And you and I have talked a bit about how the Chatham that you knew as a child and Chatham today are two very different places. Can you say a bit more about, what was there in terms of that community cohesion before and what has been lost as a result of a number of different things, but among them, the flooding?
Well, one of the things is that the South Side was still rather rural. Remember that further south was a lot of industry. So you had a lot of people who were working in those plants that lived in the Chatham area at that time. So the housing was built very quickly. They had kind of totaled the natural landscape. So it was, think of it as the Indiana dunes. So we were sort of like a little drift away from the dunes, but we had dunes, like right in the middle of a parking lot, in the big, huge trees, which were probably there, 100 years already. So with all of these different geographic things going on, plus we were at a lower level because remember the lake covered all of that area at one time until they drained the water out to build. And so with all of these different pieces coming together, for me, it was like, okay, this is really complex. So what is the impact of it? We know that we're at a lower elevation. Well, then I found that because of that, the way the pipes were laid out, they were not addressing that all of these different blocks, parts of the community needed to be served. And then on top of it, Mayor Daley, number one, decided to build the Dan Ryan to keep up the redlining, so to speak. And I believe as I've gotten more information, and she's really helped me, is that may have had a major impact why we started seeing an increase in flooding like in the 60s and 70s. And then it just kind of leveled off a little bit. It wasn't real extreme weather, but you still would get heavy storms. Well, now that we have the other influences going on, you can't miss it because it's flash flooding. The streets, the water comes over the curb now. And didn't do that before. And now your whole property, your yards are flooding. The whole 3 or 4 homes are flooded. And then the water that comes in through the sewer, but now it also is coming under the doors or any windows that are low. So it took time for me to get all of this information because we were not being engaged with as a community. You know, nowadays we talk about participatory engagement and that we should have a voice in how our communities are built up and what our needs are locally, because it is hyper-local. So with that, we know that there's more to it than meets the eye. And there's a lot of research written about it, but there's certain things like, well, what is the type of the soil? Well, I'm a gardener, and my parents were gardeners, so I know that's clay and sand under there, and you had to amend the soil to have beautiful flowers and vegetables. But the community has changed. We don't have those voices, those doctors and lawyers and teachers that initially came in, that structure of having leaders. We don't have that now. It's changed. A lot of people in my generation didn't come back after school. And all of the, the grandmas and grandpas have passed away. So now I'm the oldest person on the block, But I hold the knowledge, but people don't want to hear it because of the fears that they're just hanging on, financially to have the house. But yet it's still a threat to the community.
And I know I just wanted to remark too on how you said, we're low-lying. And I think one of the things that's come up in some of the work that we do is that there's a term called the bottom that's been, and a lot of folks who study hydrogeology may know the term the bottom. There's a very famous part downstate in Illinois across the river from St. Louis. It's called the American bottom. And a lot of people in the environmental world know it as an environmental term. It means the low-lying, wet areas along riverbeds and whatnot. What a lot of those same people don't know is that it's also a term that has grown up to mean where Black people settled in the early migrations out of the South, to describe the only areas that were ever allowed, Black people were ever allowed to own land or to settle. There is a lot of scholarship that is focused on understanding how that also became a ghettoizing term to refer to areas in urban areas that were low-lying, that were vulnerable to flooding from the beginning, and how those were racialized areas, and how we built up cities on and around those areas, and that is some of the deep history in this area too. So I think it's particularly striking that the exact same term has meanings in these different spaces that are not necessarily even known to people who are working in their silos. So I mentioned that in part because Cheryl and I have also talked a lot about being told, well, it's low-lying over there. Of course it's flooding, right? But the question is, did people have any choice as to whether they were going to live there in the first place? Were they ever told that this is an area that floods? Were they ever given opportunities to choose to live somewhere else? And what is our responsibility if, in fact, the answer was no? There never was a choice. There was, and this was a vulnerable landscape from the beginning. And that this is the same pattern that we see not just in Chicago, we see it downstate, we see it in Memphis, we see it in Detroit, we see it in basically every single major area where you have some of these patterns of racialized development and that also track current flooding and sewage issues today.
Can I bring Dan in? We haven't heard yet from Dan. Do you want to carry on this, or do you want me to?
Sure. Well, I would just like to thank Cheryl, belatedly, 5 years down the road, for all the help she gave me for a story I did on Chicago's flooding problems. It was in the middle of the peak COVID, I think it was the fall of 2020, the New York Times called and asked me what I was doing, and they must have been talking to my wife because I wasn't doing anything. And so they asked if I was interested in doing a story on Chicago's unique vulnerabilities to climate change, and I said, sure. And what I did was what most reporters do at the beginning is they read clips and they try to get up to speed with what's happening on the ground. And I started out lazy, I'll admit it. I live in Milwaukee. and my first trip, and this is COVID times, so trips were kind of weird to take anyway, but the first trip I took was to Evanston. And I looked at all the armoring that the Army Corps had been doing over the years and thought, wow, they're really investing a lot in this. And it's almost to the point where they're going to want to hope the water stays that high, because when it drops, it's going to be quite a barrier down. But after, that was just my first trip, more phone calls and conversations. And eventually I met up with Cheryl, and she took me on a tour that really opened my eyes, because we have riprap up on the North Shore, and your houses are the riprap down on the South Shore. And that was just stunning for me to see, and then to see what the New York Times could do with this data. And they really, I think, told a great story. And when I say they, I was a part of it, but there were probably 15 people involved. But nobody was more involved than Cheryl, because she gave me the ins and the outs of the whole neighborhood. But beyond that, I mean, Chicago is uniquely vulnerable, the whole city, because it was built in such a low-lying area and built on the premise that Lake Michigan is going to stay within its historic bracket, which is basically a 6-foot swing from the high water years to the low water years. And if that goes out of whack, so goes the whole plumbing superstructure, really. I mean, the Chicago River, we all know, was reversed, so it flows out of the lake. But if the lake gets too low, the river's going to, water does what water wants to, what water's going to do. It'll flow backwards. And I've never seen a place that has pushed water around like Chicago has, to magnificent effect. But again, that was a lot of work, a lot of decades putting this hard structure into place. But it's all based on an earlier regime, and I don't have any answers at all. But it's something people need to think about, that you just can't dig your way out of this. There's got to be a more flexible way forward. And I have not been on the Chicago water beat for quite a while, and perhaps people are headed down this path. But when you look at how quickly the water came up in 2014, we went from record low to just a tick below record high. That's 6 feet. They talk about oceans rising. Oh, it could be 18 inches by the end of the century. It's like, no, this happened in 4 years, and there's nothing saying, hydrologically or otherwise, that lake has to stay within that bracket. If it goes higher, everybody's in trouble. There were videos in the New York Times piece. I think one of the waves took out a couch, brought a couch back out into the lake. It was just like watching something from, the East Coast, a hurricane. It was just incredibly violent. And it'll be interesting to see. And it's not Chicago only. I mean, Milwaukee's got water issues, but Chicago is, uniquely vulnerable just because it sits so low. And these waters of the Mississippi and of the Great Lakes have a history of kind of cozying up to each other. They like each other. And maybe that's what's going on right now. And we'll see how it plays out.
And Dawn and I were talking a little bit before the panel about what do you even say when you've got an area with so many people that has moved so far away from what was there before. And I think it's, both of us said we don't have a cheery message. There is no cheery message. There is a lot of human suffering that is going to come, and it's going to come very quickly. And I think what we have tried to convey on the panel is that the answers, whatever answers there are for people who are going to make it through, are not found in the deep engineering or the massive, expensive, over trying to control nature approaches. Maybe that's where we should open up to audience questions. I'm not really sure. One other observation, though, on climate change, and since we're in Chicago, I was also saying to my husband while I was kind of talking these things through with him, just Chicago is not just at the gate of flooding, it is also at the turning point of drought. And I don't know, I'm sure there are plenty of folks in this audience who follow what's going on in the counties to the west of us and to the slight south of us, who have basically depleted their groundwater and will have nothing to drink locally within about the next 5 years. And folks may have heard about the several billion-dollar pipeline that Joliet is building to bring Great Lakes water, Lake Michigan water, out to some of those suburbs. So if you imagine this place that we sit in right today is at that tipping point between too much water and no water. And it has a really fascinating role in this future for that reason.
Yeah, in Milwaukee, we have something similar going on with the western suburbs. They're outside the Great Lakes Basin, the basin being the landmass that drains into the lake. There are communities that can practically see the lake in Milwaukee that are beyond the basin dividing line. And historically, you couldn't take water over that dividing line. The idea being, once you take water in a pipe across that line, it never comes back, so it's water lost. So the western suburbs have been fighting for a source of water, for a new source of water, Lake Michigan. They look at Lake Michigan as much as theirs as anybody who lives in downtown Chicago or Milwaukee thinks of the lake as theirs. And there was a lot of pushback against it, and it wasn't just to do with the hydrology of the lakes, it had to do with economic development, and did we really want to further, cause the western suburbs to blossom at the city of Milwaukee's expense. On the other hand, they're sucking water out of an aquifer that's contaminated with radium, so there's real public health risk, and everybody's got a right to turn on a tap of clean water, no matter where you are. It's just a matter, I think, of doing it in a just way, and we got the Great Lakes Compact out of it, which basically keeps this prohibition of taking water over the dividing line, with the exception if you're, it gets pretty technical, but basically if you're a community that's straddling that line, the other side can get the water as long as they send it back into the basin. They basically have to re-engineer themselves into the Great Lakes. And it's a system that seems to be working pretty well, but it's not permanent. This Great Lakes Compact came out in 2008 or so, and Congress, it was signed by President Bush at the time, and Congress approved it, but what Congress gives, Congress can take away. And that could happen, the way things are going these days, it could happen in the middle of the night. And then people have talked about, well, how practical is it really to send water on a large scale out of the basin, like to the west, to the parched, arid west? And it seems absurd, or at least it did to me until I did some reporting on all the oil coming in from the western US and Canada to Duluth, Superior, up in northern Wisconsin. It's about, I think, 15% of the nation's imports comes in via pipeline. And this is tar sands oil that comes out of the ground hard as a hockey puck. It has to be melted with chemicals so it'll flow in these pipes. And I did some calculations several years back looking at how much water or how much oil was coming in these pipes collectively in a day. And it was about the flow of the Milwaukee River in summer. So it was a river's worth of oil. Now, it takes a lot of energy to bring that liquid here, but those pipes can go in both directions. They do it all the time. They re-engineer them so the pumps push it the other way. We have the infrastructure in place to send water way west. And, it would take a lot of energy, but people can't live without it. And, hopefully the lakes become something that brings people into the region, rather than bringing water to the people who move out of the region. And that's a bigger question than what we have on the table today. But this climate change and water is just, everything's going to be turning sideways and upside down before we know it, I would expect.
Like what we're talking about is structural racism. At least that's the way we teach it in Canada and write about it. And environmental racism. So at Six Nations, where we are in Canada, the reason we don't have infrastructure is, again, because they thought we weren't going to be here. They took our children. I don't know if you're familiar with residential schools or boarding schools in the U.S., but they came and hauled away all our children, took them off to these schools that were basically ethnic cleansing camps. A lot of torture, a lot of horrible things happen there. Well documented in Canada, not in the U.S. They have a whole reconciliation going on. But because of that plan, the policy was thought, well, the kids are going to go and we're going to be servants to, just like colonial other places, India and Asia. They thought it would happen in North America. It did not, which is where we got the title lazy, because we refused to participate in it. So they didn't build any infrastructure. Literally where I live, I could walk across the hallway. That's Caledonia. It's non-native. They have clean running tap water. We do not, because we have no infrastructure. We have a water treatment plant, but the source water has been contaminated for over 200 years. They made Agent Orange, dumped it into, for Vietnam, a plant upstream. We have 25 wastewater plants upstream from us. Like, nobody wants to drink that water. So the elders had said, fight for the aquifer water. That is the breast milk that the Creator made for humans. That is the water that is pure and good. And when you see people destroying it for oil, I can't even describe, it's like going to a wake when you talk to elders and they see the madness that has happened on our lands in 200 years. Just the Great Lakes, in our language, it was sweet water. It was literally made by the Creator for human consumption, for animal consumption. So to see what's happening, is just consequences. And also government policy. So the reason, marginalized communities were pushed off into where they knew it would be flooding. They knew the infrastructure was poor. Reservations in the United States and Canada do not have access to clean water, which is insane when we live around the Great Lakes. But from the Southwest to here, I was at Standing Rock. We're fighting a pipeline that could and will burst and hurt the water for 18 million people. So we don't understand the thought process that goes into these decisions, right? If I were a policymaker, I would probably want to move people away from the water as much as possible, because it is going to rise. And so I think the city planners or whoever's doing these decisions need to sit down and talk to some Indigenous people about having a little bit of wisdom in the decisions they're making, so that people don't suffer as much as they likely will now, based on the kinds of decisions that are made around the Great Lakes. Like, we know it's going to flood because you weren't supposed to be here. Like, that's the bottom line. Nobody should, whether it's Miami, New Orleans, like the thinking that went into that is going to come back on the people. So I think the messaging should be considering moving people into areas that maybe not are so populated by the water. And that may not be what you want to hear.
Well, I think Cheryl and I have talked about what's going to happen in Chatham. And, one of the things that doesn't come up a lot in the green infrastructure circles until you're really past the tipping point is buyouts, right? Like, nobody wants to really talk about that, but that's essentially what is on the table for a lot of communities that do experience chronic flooding. And there's a lot of discussion too about the fact that we pumped money into allowing wealthy people to rebuild their homes in prime coastal areas, while we have given nothing to people who have been chronically flooded in low income areas. And what is our responsibility when you're thinking about each of those populations? Who moves to the safer ground, and how are we moving them? How are they getting to move? How do they find that new safe home? And are they at the front of the line, or are they at the back of the line? And I think that's those are some of the big questions we are going to be having to answer. I mean, we should have been answering them yesterday, right? And I don't know if folks are aware, but there have been buyouts that have happened throughout Illinois related to flooding. Most of them have been in reaction to riverine flooding, meaning like the water comes up out of the riverbeds and flows over the land and hits people's homes. We are now seeing there are homes that have been destroyed by chronic urban flooding, which is when the built infrastructure gets overwhelmed and the water comes back up. And we have entire areas in the state of Illinois. If folks have never been down to the East St. Louis area, that whole area is getting wiped out right now. You have people who bought their homes, they sunk their entire life savings into homes that were the new black, like middle class suburbs. And their homes are now worth roughly the same as what they bought them for back in 1970, possibly less. And we actually have the real estate data on those valuations, and we have the current valuation because FEMA has gone there and has had to put a market dollar amount to these people's homes. So, and one of the things too that I want to make sure I note is that these things are all very well known in the housing world. In the housing advocacy world, all of this is like 101. It is not well understood in environmental circles. A lot of environmental circles take today as a baseline. They don't ask about history. And what environmental justice does is it says that history matters absolutely. And that is what we all have to understand is how we got here. In the housing world, some of these places, you had Black communities rally behind bond votes to get water infrastructure built, only to then be cut out of the proceeds of those bonds. And that is a direct story from Illinois, where we had a man who went on to become one of the first leaders in the Illinois Assembly, the first Black leaders in the Illinois Assembly, brought a civil rights lawsuit against the city of East St. Louis in the 1950s because East St. Louis did exactly that. The Black neighborhoods rallied behind the water bond passed, and then their neighborhoods did not benefit from that water bond. So these are the things that other people in other spaces outside of the kind of traditional environmental world, they know deeply, and it grounds everything that they do. And part of what we need to do is break outside of our silos of only thinking within our single disciplines and ask ourselves some of these questions about, are we even looking at this problem correctly? Do we know how we got here? Who has the knowledge to show us a way forward? And make sure that we are asking more questions and listening more rather than going into spaces and claiming that we have the answers.
And to your point, we've had tax increases out in Chatham where I live, but yet we are not getting the option to move out of our homes. If you've been repetitively flooding and you have those old bungalows, they're double wall brick, they have no insulation. The foundation inside the house is about this thick, so there's sand under there. So with all that water pressure, it cracks. And you get it fixed and it cracks. And you can literally see the bubbles because that water is all in your foundation and in your walls. And they don't consider that when FEMA comes out to do an assessment. They want to see stuff's been moldy and floating and you have drywall. Well, we have brick basements. They're not drywall. So all that water causes them to literally turn to powder. So who's going to re-brick a 1,200 square foot house? And you have a back porch and you have a backyard and you have a garage. So materials wise, our infrastructure, our homes are obsolete. They're not ready for the changes that are occurring. You don't have the skilled craftsmen that even know how those homes were built unless you have the blueprints. So we as advocates, we have to be housing people, we have to be architect whizzes, we have to be FEMA knowledgeable. We have to take all that into our conversations of what are the barriers, what are the priorities, how do we make sure we have the right answers and we're moving forward and not just doing patchwork. Because when they give the declarations and they come out, well, less than 12 months later, you have another storm and then they see that you fixed it and they're not going to give you any money. It's a mess. So all of it is not beneficial, and what communities suffer the most vulnerable.
And you said property tax increases. We were just talking about how some of that property tax goes to fund the regional sewer system, right? And if folks remember the map of the regional sewer system trunk lines, Chatham is right in that open area on the south side. And what that means is that there's the longest distance between Chatham and those trunk lines, or Chatham and a discharge point on a river. So when you think about why does Chatham flood, it's low and it's the furthest away from the regional sewers that people like Cheryl are paying to maintain. So that was designed by somebody at some point, right? These are some of the connections that we are hoping to start making that come as part of the conversation.
It's time for audience questions.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. And in terms of Chicago and flooding, like I live on the northwest side, and in 2023, that big storm, and then in 2022, my basement flooded twice within a year. But I'm wondering to hear from the panelists, like as individual homeowners or people in the city, what can we do either to form alliances with other areas of the city like Chatham that are experiencing this kind of flooding, or just broadly in terms of pressuring our elected officials to make infrastructure changes? Like what are some takeaways that we might be able to do to address some of these structural problems?
I'll jump in first and then maybe pass to Cheryl. So I think this presentation was not meant to say that other areas don't flood, right? And I think what we were trying to say was, if you flooded once or twice, think about how you should be advocating in relation to people who have flooded chronically for the last 30 years, right? And if your home was okay and you had enough money to like repair the sump pump, flush out the basement, re-drywall, imagine if you we're living on $16,000 a year, which is what is the median household income in some of the areas. So there's definitely room for connections and alliances. And I think one of the questions that is on my mind a lot in the the climate change future is, if you are that person who is impacted but not as much as other people have been for decades, what is your responsibility? What are you willing to give up? What are you willing to advocate for on behalf of other people and not yourself? How open are you to understanding the full scope of the problem versus your share of it? And I think those are very, very hard and very, very personal decisions about where you come out and what you want to lend your voice to. So I don't think there's any one, like, I wouldn't prescribe that everybody should go do this, right? I do think it's the whole adage of getting involved is critical, right? I think some of what we've seen is, it's especially when it's sewage backup, and this goes to what Dawn was saying about the psychological, like just the trauma that's involved. People who have had chronic flooding and sewage backups in their houses, there's a deep, deep, deep trauma. There's embarrassment, there's social isolation. Imagine that you had raw sewage in your basement chronically. You can't really invite anyone over. You don't really want to tell anyone because it's just deeply embarrassing. You feel cut off from everybody. And if that is not your reality, but you somehow are personally impacted by this issue, try to understand what it looks like for people who have it 100 times worse and have for many, many years, right? So some of this is a call. We're going to have to distribute very limited resources. As Dawn was saying, people might have to start moving to other places. Try to start thinking about, am I moving myself and my family first? Is that my first consideration? Or are there other things that I should be trying to do before that kind of a reaction? So for me, it's more of like a psychological exercise now, kind of taking into account some of the things that you might have learned today, and less like a prescription of like, go out and say this or ask for this policy or anything like that.
And if I may suggest, you might want to try to get more information from your alderman about what the sewer infrastructure is like in your area. Because like I said, we're in an area where it's very distorted. It has no connection to like where the houses are. And, these are houses mostly, it's not apartments. So you had families in there, lots of people in these different homes. So that makes it, overwhelming too. But if you have neighbors who've experienced it as well, it may be just on your block that sewage pipe that goes down your block was never replaced and it's too small. So just getting more background information about what's causing this to you may give you more direction on which way to go.
Hi, I have a comment and a question. First off, I want to really thank you for bringing up the plight of East St. Louis. I was stationed in that area with the Air Force. I bought my first home down there in 2012. And the level of racism in that housing market is insane. I was redlined, and the bank initially would not tell me why they missed my closing or tell me what was wrong with the deal. And then when it eventually all came out, it was like, how many different ways can you tell me my neighbors are black? I knew that. I still want to live here. Moving on to today. Today I work from the McKinley Park neighborhood here in Chicago, which is home to the water treatment plant where a lot of this stuff goes. And one of our big projects in the neighborhood is to advocate for reopening the riverfront to the public, some of which has been closed for over 150 years. Industry is leaving the neighborhood on its own terms, and while that is generally a good thing, we're also very cautious about what happens next in this area. So in other words, we don't want a bunch of high-end housing to suddenly move in on the waterfront. That's for everybody. And so that's our particular situation. Of course, we are also the site of Mud Lake. I very much appreciated Dawn's presentation. Mud Lake, also known as the Chicago Portage, which is the reason Chicago is here, because people came to trade with Native people who were using this area to move between watersheds, and that naturally occurring infrastructure has been utterly destroyed and turned into something that we live with today in many different ways, including sewage in our waterways. And so as we kind of think ahead about this, what I wanted to hear from whichever of you feels like talking about it is the role of public goods in mitigation, the role of public green space, and as you make transitions and say, no one should live here, how do we still teach people to value those areas and understand that they're necessary?
What I would do is, again, I don't have answers. Like these places can be brought back into their original, what they were supposed to be, especially watersheds. Right, so where I am, that's a watershed, and all the money that Canada and U.S. poured into the Great Lakes, they completely ignored the watersheds and the role of watersheds. So I think restoring these natural spaces back to what they originally were is possible. That's what I encourage my students and everybody I work with is look at restoration. You have brilliant engineers who are bringing natural wastewater designs that can restore. California, Texas have them. So there are ways to come back and bring back the natural world and move people into an area that is meant for people to live in, right? So I just encourage people to think about what was here prior, how was it used, that history she talks about, and then also compensating the people that were placed in these positions knowing full well that they were going to experience what they're experiencing.
Great, thanks. I actually want to address this question to Dan. I teach your book and have been a big fan for a long time as well. I would really like to hear sort of your journalistic, broad thoughts of how this has been changing over the years that you've been looking at how the Great Lakes are being protected. Where is it getting more attention, not getting more attention? You know, where have you seen the real pivot points in this area?
Well, I think it's an ongoing pivot point, and it's right here in Chicago. And when you talk about individual homes that are, you know, you do everything right, you get a flood, you get a new sump pump, you get drain tiles, you patch up the foundation, and it happens again. That's going to happen on a scale of 9 million people, because all of Chicago, we were in the middle of building TARP, which is basically trying to fix the basement, the collective basement of Chicago. And I don't know what the price tag is now, $3 billion, $4 billion, and it's not going to be adequate. And it's going to be collectively the humiliation and frustration that a homeowner feels, a city is going to feel, a region's going to feel. When I first started reporting on the Great Lakes for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel in 2002, I knew a little bit about the history of the Chicago River, but I didn't know that there was no secondary treatment. They were just sifting out the solids. That is basically, well, I mean, it's getting better. I think Stickney now does some secondary treatment. but you had an open sewer running right through the city. And that just reflects a century's worth of thinking about the Great Lakes, and that's changed. You know, people now are taking pride in the river and sometimes using it to extents that I wouldn't recommend or anybody with common sense would, but they're going in the right direction. And so I think over time, people have come to value and to respect water more than they have. Do they do it enough of either? No. That's one perspective. I also think that climate change is going to affect way more than Chicago and way more than the Great Lakes, but it's going to affect us in interesting ways, and the lakes are going to affect other communities in interesting ways and in unfortunate ways. For example, so much pollution, nutrient pollution, still goes down the Chicago River into the Mississippi, down to the Gulf of Mexico, that it's messing with the water down there. You read about the massive dead zones out in the Gulf of Mexico. But it's not just that anymore. In like 2019 or something, it was such a wet year, we sent so much water down the Mississippi River from up here that we turned the coast of Mississippi fresh water, to the point where they got toxic algae blooms because that water coming down the Mississippi wasn't just water, it was the collective, excrement of 40% of the continent. That was closing businesses. I talked to a guy in that summer who had bought a fleet of jet skis in Biloxi, Mississippi, and they closed the beach. And he had loans out on these things, and he had to take them to Georgia to sell them just to get out from underneath the debt. And his big question, which is a big question for everybody, is why am I being regulated out of business when the real regulating's got to be going way up in the watershed? And that's an ethic that I think has to and is changing. But I could go on, but
if I can jump in too, I do think this is going to escalate exponentially in the next year or so. And this is, so I follow some of the disaster declarations, the side when it gets really, really bad, really fast. And between 2013 and 2023, Chicago went with no federal flooding disaster declarations that impacted Cook County. We had 3 in the last 2 years. Not only that, but the collective dollar amount, this is only one pot of money. We're already over $1 billion worth of damage from those 3 storms. If you look at what Chicago is getting hit with combined with what Detroit's getting hit with, it accounts for 10% of the federal disaster funding that was appropriated by Congress in December for just the latest rounds of disasters. This is very different than what happened the last 20 years. The last 20 years, the vast majority of that money went to coastal communities that were getting hit by hurricanes and tornadoes and whatnot. So, all of you have sat through the storms that we've had in the last couple of seasons, right? Like, the water is coming down very differently than it did, even within recent memory. And my guess is that we're going to have another flooding disaster declaration this upcoming year, right? They're having them downstate as well in the East St. Louis area. Illinois is not prepared for that. But we are going to pay for it one way or another. We're either going to pay for it in the damage assessments after in the rebuilding, or we're going to have to pay for it in doing something very real now. And so maybe going back to the earlier question about what can we do, I also do a lot of work on water affordability. And I know there's been a lot of concern about rising sewer costs, rising water costs. Think about the fact that your water bill is probably a fraction of the other things that you spend money on if you are a person of means. Think about what it would be like if all of a sudden we are having multi-billion-dollar storms every year. Like, what are we going to be willing to pay for those who have the money to pay to do something that more fundamentally addresses this issue? And I raise this in part because my understanding is, like, we committed to TARP, we committed to those billions of dollars in 1971, I believe. And there's been a real reluctance to raise the political question of what are we going to spend now if it's not TARP? If TARP is not going to solve the problem, what do we do, and how do we acknowledge that as a region and commit to doing something else or something in addition? Because that is a big part of what's holding us back. It's we committed to combined sewers, we committed to big, deep tunnels 40, 50 years ago, and we haven't been willing to really say collectively, what else are we going to do now? There are individual communities and municipalities that have taken up some of that. And some of them are trying to actually separate their sewer system from their stormwater system and have done so to a large degree. Not every community can do that. Not every community has the money to do that. But those, I think, are some of the questions that we're going to have to face, because this is not going to get better anytime soon. And I don't think it's going to be another 10 years before we have another $1 billion disaster in the state.
I know I've been reading recently that if you grow trees, or if you cut down the trees, all of a sudden you get a lot of flooding. Okay, so and what happens in poorer communities, this was in the New York Times, the wealthy communities have lots of trees, and the poor communities have no trees, and all of a sudden, the poor communities have a lot of flooding, and they are correlated. I mean, evidently you cut down trees, boom, you get flooding. Now the problem is that you can't grow trees in 2 years. So it's a huge problem there, but certainly it would be a way of reducing greenhouse gases to fund growing bushes and trees simultaneously that can start drawing up the water, because bushes grow a lot faster than trees. And I see that you already have a response to this, so I'm looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. I'm realizing that your situation may be more extreme, and this might solve 50% of the problem, but leave 50%. Thank you.
Okay, well, as I said earlier, Chatham was like semi-rural. And it looked like something, like a portion of the Indiana Dunes. We had tons of trees. It was known for its canopy. It looked like broccoli when you walked down the street. Poor care. The first people that came up from the South, so they knew about plants and flowers and bushes. That's how Chatham looked. Like I worked in Champaign, Illinois. The streets looked the way my house looked when I was growing up. They had big flowering bushes on the lawn, and then also a big tree, fruit trees, nut trees, all over the place. Mm-hmm. They have slowly either gotten diseased, so the city came through one day, and it looked like the Brazilian forest when the trucks came in. It was like 4 trucks coming down, like 4 blocks, cutting down those ash trees. But they didn't replace them, and there hasn't been like any real aggressive campaigns within the community, because guess what? The new people don't want to rake leaves, so they don't want a tree. We have extensive tree programs right now, training, everything. People are not biting. And so it's very hard to re-educate people if they don't know the past. What did that area look like before? And in general, trees are not always going to help a community or area that is flooding, because our flooding is in the sewers. The water is, that comes down, it doesn't have any connection to just absorbency into the ground. All of us have lawns. It's the sewers are overwhelmed because we only have 12-inch sewers. They had done a lot of upgrading over the years. Why is it we still have 12-inch sewers? And then they allow people to put an extra roof on, higher roof with 3 more bedrooms in it. So that's more people. So if you just be logical at how you're developing things and what you're allowing developers to do, you would see that some of this stuff can be slowed down until you can make that next move and help people move out. Because it's no way all of us are going to get the money to fix our homes. The cost of construction is triple now. You can't even get a survey on your house or assessment. They won't even come out into Chatham because they assume that you can't afford them to come out. They'll make an appointment, but they don't come. But we know, some of us know, I know, the houses are settling. And I sit in on a lot of FEMA training, so I know that where your base at your house is, that's how they determine your insurance national flood insurance availability. So our houses have below ground basements. So yeah, the water's going to come down the stairs and seep all in. They give you no consideration for that. So even though they have services, they've cut us out in so many ways that it's like this. Well, we'll give you $300 to scrub, the mucking up that got on the floor. But they don't, well, you've been flooding before. Well, yeah, the house is 100 years old. So this is very complicated, and you have to be very wise to make sure that you're coming at it at all angles in order to get the equity that you want.
Yeah, so thank you very much to all of our presenters. That was fantastic. And we will wrap it up there for this panel. Thank you.